All right, it's working. Very good. All right, folks, this is the funding session, Funding for Real. My name is Jason Della Rocca. I'm the co-founder of Execution Labs. We're a seed fund and accelerator based out of Canada, although we do investments with studios from all over the world. We've been around just over 2 years and have done about 20 investments in independent game studios so far. So in fact, one of the more active investors in the game space. I often do presentations on funding at various conferences, and it's an area that developers don't often have experience with, right? Most developers are developers. They know how to make games and not necessarily how to chase investors or get funding. And so, we're quite open and like to talk about these topics. When I pitched GDC to do it, they said they wanted something with a bit more detail. That oftentimes the presentations tend to be, call it textbook. Here's your funding sources, and here's how you prepare a pitch, and here's how due diligence works, and this kind of stuff. And they said, well, we get that type of talk often, and so we want more nitty-gritty. And so we're actually going to dive into specific examples and case studies from studios and how they were funded. So we'll dive into there in just a moment. It's important to understand that, on the one hand, the best time to take someone else's money is never, right? Ideally, you don't need external funding. There's always strings attached. It's always going to cost you. But the reality is we are not all rich individuals, or we don't all have a rich uncle. At some point we do need to take on some form of funding. And at the same time, it's also kind of dealing with this tension that we often see where developers don't necessarily embrace the entrepreneurial side of being developers, right? There's this kind of tension between being a starving artist, someone that's suffering to make something of impact or meaning, but also being commercially driven and trying to build a business and generate revenue and funds to be a sustainable business. And it's something we see quite often. Another sort of trap that we often see is this kind of the magical pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. I always think of, do they have Lucky Charms in Europe? I don't know. I don't eat much cereal when I'm over here, but we often hear developers who are like, oh, I think I need some money. I'm going to go over there to the people who have money and go get some, without really understanding how funding works, who has the money at what stages, what's appropriate for the type of company or project they're doing. There's just kind of this, there's still this myth about the magical pot of gold, the bags of money on the other side of the rainbow, and it's not really the case. And so we try to do what we can to educate developers and get into more nitty-gritty. All right, so the first part of this presentation, we're going to dive into a bunch of case studies of developers who were kind enough to and open enough to share with me and now share with all of you and the Vault, their stories. Now, as a caveat, what I've written down on the slides has been kind of a paraphrasing or summation of often what was quite long summaries. So it's not accurate to the penny, and there's probably a few little bits and pieces missing, but overall it'll give us a sense of these different companies and studios and projects and how they were funded. So the first one we're going to dig into is a studio called Kit Fox Games. Kit Fox is actually one of the investments we did as Execution Labs last year, so they're part of our portfolio. They're working currently on their second game, which is called Moon Hunters, and this is their story. Now, I apologize for the wall of text. Normally, I don't present with wall of text, but for the purposes of these case studies, this is what we're going to go with. So importantly, this was a studio that was formed by 4 co-founders to apply to Execution Labs. So these were all experienced developers. They had worked at AAA and other studios around the industry. They were coming together to apply to Execution Labs to take on $100K of investment, plus the love, the mentorship that we provide. And they launched their studio as part of our program. They did their first game, Shattered Planet, last summer as an iOS and Android release, later port to Steam, and it generated not even enough money to sort of gain back the initial seed investment. As they were launching that game, they prepared their second game, the pitch concept for Moon Hunters, and applied to the Square Enix Collective. For those who don't know, the Square Enix Collective is a sort of community-driven platform that's hosted or sponsored by Square Enix, where developers are able to put forward a project. It looks a little bit like a Kickstarter campaign, but it's in order to get feedback and input and votes from the community, and then those projects that get a lot of votes and a lot of support, then Square Enix will offer to support you during your Kickstarter campaign and or offer you publishing deals and stuff. But anyway, so that's a whole other topic. But they had a very successful Square Enix Collective campaign. There was this kind of period where they were panicking, and so they picked up some small work-for-hire contracts. And then through our network, got some additional seed investment from one of the VCs in Canada. And then they launched their Kickstarter campaign. The ask was $40K. They netted about $160. And then in Canada, because they're based in Canada, we have something called the CMF, which is it's like a media fund that's partially government funded. And so within a week's time, they got both the successful Kickstarter campaign as well as the CMF money in sort of 2 tranches to close out the funding for the project. And then their plan is to launch on Steam. They're skipping early access and doing a PlayStation 4 port. So what's interesting in this case is there was no self-funding, right? They didn't put in any initial investment on their part. They took on both private sort of VC money as well as project-based finance, and they leveraged community-based tools like Square Enix Collective as well as Kickstarter, of course. All right, so we're just going to drive through all of these. So that's their story. They have yet to launch. Another one, I'm guessing not many people have heard of this game. This is an example from a small studio in Montreal, not from our portfolio, called Toto Temple Deluxe, from a studio called Juicy Beast. This is a 4-person indie studio that was founded about 6 years ago, 5-6 years ago, had done a bunch of previous games that were all self-funded, and now in order to do the next project, this Toto Temple Deluxe, they're sort of putting together a bunch of resources on the company side, right? $90K from their past game sales from the previous 9 games, $30K of tax credits. So in Canada, we're well known for having access to various tax refunds and so on, so they're able to apply for some of those. They took on a little bit of friends and family money, as well as a bank loan, which is quite rare for game companies. Most indies are usually not eligible for bank loans, or bankers tend not to like indie studios. And then, amazingly, they got $55,000 from Ouya, but this was before the whole free the games and Kickstarter stuff. This was, quite a while ago. And they're about to release the game there, about to release the game this summer. So again, a much different profile than the previous one. Their first games were very much bootstrapped, and they sort of on the company side were able to put together a bunch of resources and funds in order to do the game, and then they kind of top up from Ouya, which is kind of a rare source of funding. But then leveraging the tax breaks for a little help. Another example, Switchblade Monkeys, creators of a game called Secret Ponchos. This is also one of the games in our teams in our portfolio. Secret Ponchos was launched on PlayStation 4 in the fall of last year. They were part of the PS Plus, one of the PS Plus buyouts, and they got several million downloads, and we're working with them on the Steam relaunch. This is a team of a bunch of ex-AAA developers, Activision, EA, etc. They put in some of their own money, but also sweat equity. So they put in about $50K and a few months of their own time to come up with the concept, to kind of flesh out their idea, start building an early prototype in order to secure other forms of funding. This team is also from Canada, so they were eligible for this media fund, the CMF, of which they got $300K. And they put in a bunch more sweat equity, meaning they weren't drawing salaries or much of a salary for another 2 years of development. They got a few $100,000 from Sony for a PS Plus buyout, and they launched in kind of one of the launch timeframes. Titles. They raised a bunch more money from friends and family to kind of prep to go to early access, generated about $70K. It's still on early access now, generating, moderate sales. And then we came in as external investors with $200K as part of our finishing fund. We have 2 different funds. One's a much earlier stage seed investment, only $50,000 a pop, and then we have larger sort of finishing fund investments that come in at the end of the project for larger amounts of money. And so we're working with them to kind of make the whole game at that III standard. Interestingly here is this sort of last line that they estimate and track the sweat equity at about $1.5 million. So they're actually keeping track of, how many hours, how much time and allocation all the different team members are doing, sort of vis-a-vis what they would be getting paid normally if they still have their jobs at Activision or EA or Blizzard and whatnot. They're being compensated somewhat on a revenue share model on the back end. So keeping track of the sweat equity is important and is quite significant in this case. All right, another example, Castle Story from Sauropod. This happens to be another Montreal studio, and they've been around for a little while but haven't shipped anything. So they started as a student project a few years ago, and I think it was only 2 of them at that time. Beginning of 2012, they decided to go full-time, and they took on $15,000 as a family loan. And these guys did an amazing Kickstarter. I think they were asking for something like, I don't know, 40 or 50,000, and they got $750,000 in the summer of 2012. But that was like, the heyday of Kickstarter. So they did really well. A bunch of, essentially kids out of school getting almost $1 million on Kickstarter. But they did put in a tremendous amount of effort. They spent about 3 months preparing their campaign, preparing their video, working on things in great depth, and that represented 30,000 backers. So really impressive for a young sort of no-name team. They released on early access and generated almost as much on early access sales, $700,000 in the fall of 2013, and then right away during the holiday sales generated another $500,000. And now they're up to a team of about 15, and they're expected to ship next year. Still a bit fuzzy on the timing there. But interesting, I don't know which family member gave them that $15,000 loan, but I'm guessing they got paid back. And who knows what the deal terms were on that loan. But impressive, both in terms of the Kickstarter money, but then also leveraging that on early access to then take that money, grow the team, and to deliver will deliver the finished game. And so we see some examples like that where you generate enough funds to get something onto early access that generates more funds, but it's quite rare. All right, next example. Cardboard Utopia. This is another team from our portfolio. Some ex-Ubisoft and Eidos guys working on a game called War of the Zodiacs, sort of a JRPG style game. So folks from the Child of Light team, Far Cry, etc. They quit their jobs at Ubisoft back in 2013 in bootstrap mode. They did $150,000 from friends and family. So they were able to convince the sort of rich uncle to give them, I don't think it was actually their rich uncle, but the family members to give them some funds. And then they were part of our earlier stage program. So we went in with a $50K seed investment plus the mentorship and so on. But they're still in production right now. They were also part of the Square Enix collective before they came to us. And they're one of the most highly approved titles, 93% approval rating. As I said, currently in production. And now they're looking at their options, right? They're in sort of just getting out of pre-production. They're putting their vertical slice together. They themselves are looking at Kickstarter. They are based in Canada, so they're looking at CMF, publishers, and so on. But we'll have invested a decent amount of money and time before getting to that stage. All right, a team from Europe. PlayRaven, based in Finland. Very hot market these days for investment and funding. PlayRaven launched Spymaster on mobile. Now they're working on RoboSide plus some other games. A growing studio out of Finland. Here's just sort of some of the summary of their funding. When they founded, this is in euros, not dollars. But I didn't know which key to press to put the euro sign. So the founders themselves, who were industry veterans, were able to put in some of their own funding to get started. Then they were able to pull together various sources of public funding for an additional 70K euros. And then the very famous Tekes, which is the government-driven R&D funding agency, went in with 100K of matching funds. That was enough for them to then work on their prototype and then do a full sort of investor round, of which they raised 5 million, which is impressive for a startup. But again, these are industry veterans, and they're in Finland, which is a hot market, so a lot of investor eyeballs are in that region. And then again, another 600K of matching funds from Tekes. And then, this year, they kind of got their follow-on dollars from Tekes. What's interesting with Tekes is it's a matching fund, but it's delayed, meaning you have to raise the money from private sources, spend that money, and then if you're part of the Tekes program, then they kind of reimburse you at a matching level, for the actual expenses you do. So Tekes is very helpful in terms of that kind of leveraging. You can't just walk into the door at Tekes and say, hey, Tekes, I hear you invest in games, give me $1 million. They'll say, well, no, you have to go out in the world, get your first $1 million, spend it, and then you come to, you'd probably you'd be signed up already, but meaning you have to do your own hustling, you got to do your own raise, you have to start actually spending the money, and then they start matching. So that's why you kind of see this delay pattern on the part of Tekes. Their first game, Spymaster, was a top 10 release, was very, very well reviewed. Not a huge amount of sales, but what's important, particularly in the mobile context, is the funding they got, the 5 million plus the Tekes money, was meant to fund multiple productions, right? It wasn't just to sort of blow the whole load right on the first game, sort of do or die on one project. What we're seeing is you have to raise funds for a larger duration of time for a portfolio of projects, because it's unlikely that, especially your first one, is going to be a huge success. So they put out Spymaster, RoboSide's in soft launch now. They're working on the next Spymaster game. They have a third IP that I don't remember the details. Is in production as well. So again, larger amount of funding, so the studio can kind of survive long enough to get multiple projects out the door. All right, I think this is the last example. Another Nordic studio called Snow Castle, working on a game called Earthlock, Festival of Magic. This one is 3 slides long, and I'm not going to go into detail. But it's quite sort of dramatic. You're going to be taking 3 pictures, so and I even left out some of the details. But it's a company founded in 2009, also from some industry veterans. It started with $15,000 of self-funding, and they start doing work for hire. Work for hire is not enough to stay in business. So then they say, well, let's go get some funding from some of the Norwegian innovation funds and public funds, and let's start working on our own IP. And they go through, you can sort of see here, several rounds of founder funding, getting some angel investors, going to the Norwegian Film Institute, Nordic Game Grants, leveraging literally every source possible to pull together funding. Here, they've already done several rounds of funding and getting several chunks of money from granting agencies. They had a failed merger, all this kind of stuff, and they're still putting in their own money. And this is like barely 2-3 years into their efforts. Again, I'm not going to go into all the details, but it's like almost 4 or 5 years later now. They're working on the 4th game, Earthlock, and still kind of. They had a failed Kickstarter, trying to get all the different sources of the Film Institute and Nordic Game Grants, all this kind of stuff, all along the way, and continuing to put in, funds from the investors, taking advantage of I forgot the D, R&D tax deductions. And then, raise another chunk of money. Now they've gone through all this, and in 2015 they're attracting, U.S. investors, another 200K coming in, and the game is still not done. I mean, there are 3-4 games in, right? This is the 4th game. Target launch is first half of 2016. They have a cash in the bank for January. So even after all of that, they still don't have all of the funds they need to actually ship the game. So they're going to go through another round of angels and tax breaks and Norwegian Film Fund, et cetera, et cetera. If you add it all up, approximately the private funds that have gone in from the founders and sort of friends and family, 700K, and total budget about 1.5 million. But in all these sort of little chunks all along the way. All right, so those are the examples I was able to pull together in time for GDC. Again, thank you to each of those studios who were open enough to share their stories. And really, we kind of rushed through those, but time allowing. So now we'll talk a bit about some of the sort of traps, issues, challenges with regards to getting funding. And the first one is just the kind of smell test, right? It's interesting, just looking at those few examples, the extent to which people have put in their own money, have allocated sweat equity, or meaning giving up opportunity cost, chased down every source of funding from film institutes and tax breaks and public funding agencies, as well as going after VCs and investors, et cetera, et cetera. I think a lot of people who think they want funding don't necessarily understand all of the different sources and the amount of effort to kind of patch things together and how much work it is. In many cases, if you're doing real fundraising, that in and of itself is a full-time job. And if you're a small independent studio and you're the CEO but also the lead programmer, you don't have much time to be programming if you're also chasing all of these sources of funding and reading up how all the different institutes work, et cetera, et cetera. And so you really have to be honest with yourself and think, would I even invest in myself? Right? If you're going to go ask your mom for a loan and the government for money, all these different things, it's amazing, and we see it still every day, where the developers, and I don't want to use the word entitled, but it's just they've got this idea and they think it would be cool, and if someone gives them the money, then they'll do it. But if they had to put in all that sweat equity and their own money, I wouldn't do that. And yet they're asking us for money. So there's that smell test. Like, think about whether or not you would actually do it yourself. The next one is this notion of incrementality, if that's even a word, or incrementalness, I don't know. Where there's a sense that you don't want to be filling up your gas tank part way, right? You have to put enough gas in the tank to make it across the finish line. And so you can see a big difference between the last example I gave, Snowcastle, where literally every 3 months they were taking on new investment, just to last another 3 months to then go chase more funding, is a much different approach than, for example, Castle Story, right, where they got the big chunk of funding in one shot. They did their early access, and then they kind of hunkered down, and they're able to produce the rest of the game. Or if you look at PlayRaven, right, where they took on a little bit of funding at the beginning, and that was enough to sort of put the team together and build the prototype in order to secure the larger round of funding, the $5 million from institutional investors and techers. So they were able to use a little bit of funding to get more funding, and then they're done. So usually investors don't want to fund you to only get halfway around the track. Right? They want some sense that their resources, their funds, are going to get you to some actual objective. Now, that objective could be the launch of the game, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. It could mean, like in the case of PlayRaven, it could mean that if I'm an early stage investor, I want the sense that my money will get you to do a full round of investment. And to me, that's the finish line, or that's getting across, maybe more like a rally, right? That's sort of the next checkpoint. So I want to fund you enough to get to the next checkpoint, And that next checkpoint could be the launch of the game, but in some cases it's being able to secure additional funds from other sources. And so it's very dangerous to kind of get stuck on the treadmill where you're only taking on enough money to last another 3 months or another 6 months, because then you're always on that treadmill and chasing investors, and you have no time to do the real work. So it's something to keep in mind. Another concept is what I call scaffolding, in that investors generally want to see that what they're investing in serves as scaffolding to do the next thing, right? So the people you're hiring, the tools you're using, the technology you're building, the expertise you're learning on game 1 should apply to game 2 and game 3 and game 4, et cetera, such that as a team, as a studio, you're accelerating the pace at which you're making games, and you're also accelerating the quality. I'll give the example of KitFox. The vision for their studio is to build games with interactive narrative and procedural generation. And this has both design as well as technical implications. And the very first game they did, Shattered Planet, was a sci-fi game, sort of a roguelike, where you're landing on a planet, you're exploring stuff, you're killing aliens, and you die and sort of repeat the process and regenerate. And so the whole world was built procedurally, so they had to build some technology on top of Unity that allowed them to do procedural world generation. And then the story, the narrative, was like sort of built in snippets, where a bit like Bastion, sort of as you killed a monster, there was a little story piece about how you killed the monster, and then you explored and sort of built the little story as you went. And they were building those systems because they had Moon Hunters in mind as the second game. So they were able to take the procedural generation stuff that they used for Shattered Planet and extend on it to do Moon Hunters, and then the story snippets piece, the design and technology bits that went into that, they also re-leveraged that and extended upon it in Moon Hunters, where you're like looking at the stars and building your mythology as a hero and all this kind of stuff. Whereas if they started at Moon Hunters and said, let's do Moon Hunters with all this complicated stuff, it would have taken them way more time, way more resources. But because they were thinking of the scaffolding at the first game that made the second game better, and then already on their third game, they have similar ideas of community-driven narrative, all this kind of stuff, where all of the tech and tools and design learning, everything that they've done on the first 2 games will then sort of apply to that third game, and in theory should make that third game better, easier, faster to build, and it'll enable them to innovate on new elements. And this is, I wouldn't say it's rare, but we don't often see that kind of vision on the part of studios, right? Many studios are, well, I'm building this robot game right now, and I'm ignoring the rest of the world, and everything is on this robot game. I have no clue what I'm doing tomorrow because I need to make sure this robot or whatever game succeeds. And as an investor, that worries me because I want to see that scaffolding. I want to make sure that the next game, goes smoother than the first one. And you can imagine if, let's say, the game you're working on right now is using Unreal, it's a VR game, and it's, I don't know, a narrative, single-player story, whatever. And then you tell me that the next game you want to do is ninjas and robots in space, multiplayer on Unity for mobile. The tech, the tools, the skill set, the design principles are so dramatically different from one to the other that you just sort of lose a lot of efficiencies there. So scaffolding is very, very important. Another one is this kind of sense of ambition. And this one's hard to get around because if you're being a very pragmatic, independent studio, you're going to build a game for the resources you have on hand, which may be very limited resources, right? So you do something small, you do something quick, you do something that only takes 3 people, or whatever the case may be. It's very hard to take that sort of pragmatic game and then pitch that to investors. Because then as an investor, we say, well, it's not enough. It's not ambitious enough. Like, I totally understand why you're doing that size or scale of game, but then just do it on your own. Don't come to an investor to invest that. That you should just get done on your own and get it out the door. And so there's often this sort of mismatch. And it's weird because on the one hand, I like to hear developers who say that. Well, we're only 3 people, and so we have to think very smart about how we use our resources, so this is the scope of the game. But it's hard for me to get a sense that you really need my money and or that my money makes a difference, right? So there's always this sort of sense that you have to be shooting slightly further ahead than what you can actually get done on your own. So there's a sense that, okay, with my funds and plus my coaching or mentorship or connections, okay, together, well, now we can really do something awesome together. So there's kind of balancing the pragmatism versus the ambition of bringing investors on board. And it's a subtle one, but it's tough. All right, another one, the lawyers. When I think of lawyers, I always think of him. Are there any lawyers in the room? No? Well, now that they're too ashamed to put up their hand. Anyways. So it's super, super critical to get call them the professionals involved, right? The accountants, the tax specialists, the lawyers, et cetera. They absolutely have to be involved anytime you're taking on funding, talking to investors, all of this kind of stuff. Super, super crucial. On the one hand, it's easier for us. I mean, when we do investments in studios, most of them will say, "Oh yeah, I looked over the documents. It's fine," and they want to sign, and we stop them and say, "No, you like." We're the good guy, like we're the indie-friendly investors, but you, as a form of good practice, you need to have a lawyer look at this so that they can make sure that there's not something that needs your attention or whatever. But still, so many developers, think they understand legalese and or don't think it's worth the investment of paying lawyers and accountants and stuff to look at their documents, but absolutely, absolutely critical. So when you're looking at investments, funding, talking to the lawyers, it really comes down to two parts: economics and control. Everything about a deal, everything that you're going to be negotiating, it's going to be some element of the business, the economic piece, and the control piece. And those things are quite dramatically different, whether or not you're looking for funding for your project or whether you're looking for funding for your company. And we'll kind of go through some of these differences. All right, so project versus company. From an economics point of view, it's the difference between a revenue share deal versus equity or shares. Right, so on a project-based deal, usually an investor is going to give, or a publisher or whoever is going to give you money in exchange for a share of future revenue. And you're going to have a negotiation about how much money do they give, how much revenue share do they give up, are they going to recoup 100% on the first dollar, what are all these nitty-gritty elements of the revenue share, and it's a very intense part of the discussion. Whereas for company-based funding, it's how much money am I going to give you in exchange for how many shares of your company? What percent of the ownership of the company will I take over as an investor? And all of the rules around that equity and what kind of shares are they and what voting rights do I have, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really the economic discussion, revenue share versus equity. From a control point of view, on project-based investments or funding, it's usually control over the IP, your intellectual property, your game. Now, even if you're going to do a deal where the publisher or whoever says, "Oh, well, you get to keep the IP, I won't take it from you, it's yours," there's still going to be rights and hooks and vetoes that they have on that IP. Maybe they have the right to sign the sequel. Maybe they're going to want rights to do movies and TV shows and merchandise. Maybe they're going to want, some kind of creative veto right on, I don't know, whatever, character designs or something, right? So even if you're able to negotiate that the IP is yours from an ownership point of view, there's no question that in the contract there will still be certain rights and hooks or advantages that investor maintains. On the company side, really what you're talking about is control of the company or board control, right? As an investor, now if I buy 20% of your company, I get 20% of the vote. Or maybe I get a board seat, so now I have one of the 5 or one of the 6, 7 board seats. It's rare that you're relinquishing entire control of your company, which is also, often we sort of get that as a myth. So I don't want to take on investors because that means I lose complete control of my company. I mean, unless they're buying out all of your shares, then that's not the case, right? Normally, it's an investor buys 10%, 20%, 30% of the company, and then that represents how much control they have. So in most cases, the founder or the co-founders would still maintain majority control, but investors will have certain rights, certain vetoes. So for example, when we invest in studios, it's usually a very small amount of equity, 15, 10, 5%, usually always under 15%. So relatively small amount of equity. So it really gives us no power when it comes time to vote, because everyone else will say yes and we'll say no, and then the yeses have it, and so we have very little control. But we do have certain veto rights. So as one example, we have a veto right that says we need to approve the sale of your IP. And this is to avoid shenanigans. So let's say you want to trick us and say, I'm going to have my mom set up a new company, and I'm going to sell my IP to my mom for $1, and then Execution Labs is going to own 15% of essentially no value, like nothing, the old company that now has been emptied from its value. So we would, even though we only have, let's say, 10% ownership of the company, we still have call it a super priority right to approve any sale of the IP, so that you can't do that kind of, trickery. Now, hopefully that would never happen, and you'd never want to trick us, and we have a good relationship and all that kind of stuff. But, those are the kinds of things, the little sort of control elements that we would have as a company-based or an equity-based investor. Also, you have to bear in mind the so-called the goals or priorities, in that the goal of a project-based investor or financier is to get the project to market. Why? Because their economics for them is based on revenue share. The game only generates revenue when it's on the market. So all they care about is getting that game to market. So there's going to be a lot of, call it short-term pressure to release. Ideally, you have a good partner, and they'll give you the time it takes to make a good quality product. So when the product is released, it does well, and you don't push something not ready out the door. But definitely a short-term, get the product out there type of mindset from those who are investing in a project where they're incentivized or rewarded based on revenue share. On the company side, slightly different, right? They own equity in the company. They want to see the value of the company grow. And so their focus is on growth, and it's a slightly longer term orientation. So Execution Labs, as one example, we take a 5+ year horizon, right? We're investing in someone. We hope that in 5 years' time, that's really when they're doing their sort of blockbuster level work. We're not necessarily expecting that the first game they do right away will be, make us all millionaires. But we want to do the things and put them on the path and coach them in such a way that the studio is viable, sustainable, long term. So all that scaffolding pays off by the time they're doing their 4th or 5th game. So slightly longer term, more of a growth orientation, because they want the value of their equity, the value of the shares in the company to gain value. All right, project funding sources. Now we're getting a little bit into textbook stuff. I won't dwell on this in too much detail, but we can already start to see, if we look back at the examples I ran through, some of the sources that have been used, right? So folks taking, sweat equity, their day job, past jobs, their personal savings, investing in their own projects, their own companies, taking on loans and debt, credit cards, leveraging friends and family, patronage doesn't happen as often. That could be, your spouse maybe has a good job, and so you can sort of, have fun making games while they, bring home the bacon. Winning festivals and prizes. I mean, it's a nice little bonus, but it's hard to really build a business plan around winning festivals. And the amounts are relatively low. I mean, crowdfunding, of course, early access, alpha and pre-sales. Publishers remain today probably still the largest source of funding for projects on the planet. As we saw in many of the examples, access to different government programs like the TECAs, like different tax breaks. In Canada, there's the Canadian Media Fund, Norwegian Film Institute, Nordic Game Grants. I mean, even in Germany, there are various, film agencies and media agencies in the different states and stuff that do provide funding. Banks are rarely a source of project financing for games. Right? Banks just don't like us. A game developer walks into the bank and they're just not interested. Now, if you are a large game studio that's had lots of success and has sold millions of units and you have oodles of cash, you go to the bank and you say, hey, I'd like a credit line or fine, they'll loan it to you. But if you're in startup mode, if you're an indie, handful of people, still sort of struggling to make ends meet, the bank is not an option. So those are just some of the sources. I mean, these should be the sources that most of us are familiar with or have experience with, less so on the VC side of things. So when we're talking about equity-based financing, the options, it's really a question of time. So there's my little graph where the horizontal axis is time, zero intercept, and I mean the vertical revenue or profit, I mean it depends on the investor. If we think of the sort of life cycle of a company, we start at time zero, we're not making any revenue, we're spending all our money, so it's kind of negative revenue or profit over time, and then slowly, we start generating revenue, hopefully, and we kind of cross over the break-even line. So I mean, just oversimplification, but for our purposes, we'll just go with that. And so there's different stages of funding and different sources of funding on the company, on the equity side. So in the very beginning, you have the 3 Fs, which is known as friends, family, and fools, or what they call love money, because only someone who loves you is crazy enough to give you money at that stage. And usually it's small amounts, right? So which was the example? Like Castle Story got the 15,000, from friends and family. There are a few other examples where there was a little bit of money coming from friends and family investors. This is from your mom, this is from your spouse, this is from your rich uncle, and they love you, and it sounds like fun. They got a bit of spare money, so they help you out with a few thousand dollars, a few thousand euros. You use that money to fund the development of your prototype, start building your concept, maybe bring on a team member, a co-founder. And then you go to the next stage of funding, which is what we call angel investors. Angel investors are defined as rich individuals that invest, meaning they're people. They're not formal, companies or funds. They're just, rich people. It tends to be people who got rich in the same business you're in. Right? This, in part, is why we see so many angel investors in the general tech world or Silicon Valley. Because every time Google or Amazon or whoever buys a tech company, and those co-founders, each put $100 million in their pocket. Well, then they tend to take some of that money and then invest, back into the ecosystem and serve as angels and so on. The game industry, there are not that many angels around because we haven't seen that many exits in that sense. There are, but it's quite rare. So, angels is a hard segment, and there's generally kind of a big gap in that chunk. But again, we saw some examples like Snowcastle. They were able to go out and get angel investment. Part of the problem with the angels is we don't know who they are. Right? Normally, this is through personal connections, through a friend of a friend. There's no, you can't open up the yellow pages and say, "Show me all the angels," or there's no. They're just hard to find, particularly in games. The next level up is seed VCs. And I mean, these numbers are also ballpark numbers. I mean, they're probably slightly higher if you're in Silicon Valley, slightly lower if you're, I don't know, somewhere in Europe. I mean, in Canada, it's lower than that. I mean, so these are super rough ballpark numbers. But now, so seed VC is still generally, they're coming in before you've really proven that the product is going to make millions of dollars, right? So they're kind of coming in right before the crossover point. So you're still selling them on faith. You're still selling them on the sizzle, on the potential, on how awesome your team is and how much buzz you've been building. Everyone before the crossover point, they really are taking a gamble because you haven't yet been profitable, right? They're still betting on that vision, the belief in the team, all that kind of stuff. Once we cross over there, now you have the more traditional VCs putting in a couple $1 million. Generally, though, you're already generating, a decent amount of revenue, decent amount of profit, and they're there mainly to fuel your success, right? They want to see you're succeeding a little bit already, and they're going to invest more so you can succeed more or succeed even faster. And then you kind of have the growth VCs that are putting in big checks, big amounts of money, but are very late stage. So if you are going to chase equity investors, if you want formal investor money to invest in your company, you have to be thinking about where on this blue line are you. Right? And one of the biggest mistakes is oftentimes people who are starting out over here say, oh, I need to go talk to some VCs. And they start calling up these guys. And these guys will say, well, you're wasting your time, right? You haven't even built a prototype yet, and you want $1 million. So you do have to think about where you are, and this sort of speaks to the incrementality side of things, right? You have to take on a little bit of money from your uncle to get a team member to build your prototype, to then seduce an angel who gives you $100,000, that then you get 2 more team members, you build your vertical slice, and that allows you to go get seed VC, and then that allows you to have funds to launch the game, and now you're making money, and so you have to sort of layer it or stage it in this way. Now, in some cases, your own funds, whether it was your sweat equity or a government grant or whatever, may allow you to skip a few of those stages, right? Or you got lucky on your first 2 games, and now you've already made a couple of $1 million, and you're putting those millions into your 3rd game, and you're kind of already here. Fine. Then you can go straight to the VCs and ask them for a matching $1 million or whatever. But don't go see the VCs if really what you need is friends and family money. Likewise, if you need $1 million, don't go talk to your mom for a loan for $15,000. It goes in both directions. All right. In terms of some good books, Venture Deals is an excellent book that really breaks down all the details of term sheets and how deals are put together, the economics of investors and VCs. If you're going to go down that path, you absolutely must read this book. Art of the Start is also a nice book, kind of a more holistic book on being a startup and chasing funding and working on your pitch and all of this kind of stuff. So those are two good books to start with for those who are interested in these topics. Another thing I want to cover is what does indie even mean, and sort of what types of studios are suitable targets for investment. And there's a lot of debate, who's an indie, what does independent mean, all this kind of stuff. And so I'll give my own version of that. So here I have my nice little quadrant set up. Vertical axis is the degree of which you have creative freedom. So the top, that means you're making your own ideas. You have ownership and control of your IP. So you have creative freedom or creative independence. Whereas on the bottom you don't. And then on the right side for legal independence means it's your own company. It's me and him, and we're co-founders, and we own the company, and no one else has bought it. We're not on the stock exchange, whatever. We have legal independence. And so to me, the definition of an indie is that you have creative freedom and legal independence. Doesn't matter what style of game you're doing. Is it pixel graphics? Is it retro? Are you one guy or 10 people? Are you, are you making money, not making, to me that doesn't matter. It's creative freedom, legal independence. If you have both, that means you are independent. Work for hire studios go down here, right? So your own legal company, right? So we're an outsourced shop that does art assets, but we're making tanks for World of Tanks, or we're doing character drawings for Disney or something. So we don't have that creative independence. So work for hire. In here would be internal studios, right? So you don't have creative freedom and you're not legally independent. You're the team at Ubisoft that's been told to make the 13th Assassin's Creed. Cool, but you're an internal studio. And then up here would be the more rare kind of R&D or skunk works, where you're an R&D team at Ubisoft or Activision, whatever, and someone says, here's the Oculus Rift, go hide in a closet for 6 months and do crazy stuff, right? So all of a sudden you have creative freedom, but you're not legally independent. You're still the R&D team at Activision or whatever. So as an investor, obviously enough, I'm interested in the indies, right? First of all, these ones are not independent, so they're not really investable. They're on the stock market. And work for hire is not really attractive from an investment point of view because it's such a low margin, very tough business to be in. So I'm interested in the indie, and that's sort of in large part why. Now, we can take the indie square and blow it up further across two other axes. So now this is kind of like we're diving into the indie square. And then I think of indies across also two spectrums. One is the degree of commercial intent. So the top is, to what extent are we actually doing this because we want to make money, generate revenue, et cetera, or not? And then to what extent is the work that we're doing having impact, right? From a gameplay, innovation, design, visual aesthetic, the story we're telling, it has some kind of meaning, has some kind of vision to it. This quadrant is what I would define as independent entrepreneurs, right? So they're doing work that's meaningful, that's creative, that's innovative, they're making fun games, but they're doing it with commercial intent. They're actually doing this to make money, generate a profit, et cetera. Down here would be the proverbial starving artists, where they're doing interesting work, doing something visionary, but they're almost, they're shunning economics, right? They almost are ashamed to make money. They're suffering for their art. The folks down here are just lost, right? They're not doing visionary work. They have no commercial intent. I'm teasing. It could be just a hobbyist or someone that's just getting started. They're not quite sure where they're going. And then the sellouts are up here, right? So they have commercial intent, but what they're doing is not really impactful. So everyone that's doing a Candy Crush clone can go up here, right? Or a Clash of Clans, right? So they have creative freedom. They said, let's make a Candy Crush clone. They're legally independent because they're their own company. They have commercial intent. If we make a Candy Crush clone, we're going to make millions, but they don't have vision. They don't have impact. So I put them in the kind of sellouts quadrant. They're still indies. But they're in this sort of sellout mode. It should be pretty obvious. As an investor, I'm interested in the independent entrepreneurs. Because as someone who's been in the game industry 20 years, I believe in games. I believe in the potential of games. I want to get behind projects that I'm excited about, that I think actually have, potential to impact the industry. But I'm an investor, so I also have to make sure that I'm backing an entrepreneur that actually wants to make money and generate revenue from that. So just quickly then, a few examples. Rami Ismail from Vlambeer. No one would question that the games they're doing are artful, interesting, innovative, fun games, but also, he's a cunning, ruthless businessman. I mean, he's super open, very, very sharing. He helps everyone, but at the end of the day, he's making money, and that's definitely his intent. Nathan Vella from Capybara, also one of the co-founders and partners of Indie Fund. One of probably the more famous game they did was Sword and Sorcery on iPad, one of the best-selling iPad games of all time. Awesome little indie team, 20 people in Toronto. But very shrewd, very smart business person. Making innovative, artful games, but also building a very strong business. Jenova Chen from Journey, right? That game company did Flow, Flower, Journey. Right? No one would question that the games that they're producing are amazingly innovative, compelling games, but also very good at business. Right? They had a three-game deal with Sony coming out of school. They raised, I think, 5 or 6 million VC money last year. All their games have been successful to certain, to varying extents. And then, of course, this guy, also an independent entrepreneur. So, oftentimes when I talk about funding, I do get this, as I said at the beginning, this sort of tension of, well, I'm a developer, I'm creative, I'm so focused on making meaningful games and interesting, impactful games that anytime you talk about bankers and investors, it kind of makes me cringe. And there's this very sort of binary view of, again, either I'm a starving artist or I'm a sellout. And in reality, there are very successful independent entrepreneurs. And if you're going to be that kind of independent entrepreneur, you need to understand who can support you, who to partner with, what sources of funding are out there. It's not all the same. You need to do your homework. And hopefully that gave you a little bit of insight into the funding process. Thank you very much. We have some time for some questions. I'm happy to take any questions. Is there a microphone? Or yeah, there's a microphone.
Checking if it's on, yeah. I was just wondering in your last slide where you divided up the indies.
This one?
That one, yeah. And you called the Candy Crush people for sellouts, like if they made copies of Candy Crush, and I can agree with you on that. But if you think of the independent entrepreneurs as like an avant-garde movement that always push the barrier of what you can do, what about people who just make games within a genre, like after a while Candy Crush becomes a genre, and then you can make Candy Crush clones, like Doom clones in the beginning, and where do you stand as an investor if you just want to make games within a popular genre, like for instance a Zelda-like clone, but it's a genre of games. Yeah,
I mean that's a fair question, and certainly anyone who's making a first-person shooter or RTS, I mean you have certain set genres, but I think the difference is with the sellouts, they're very intentionally doing a Candy Crush clone because they think they can make a quick buck. And they have no intent to do anything interesting, to innovate, to do something artful. I just don't want to waste my time there. If you're an independent entrepreneur and you come to me and say, hey, we're making, for example, a first-person shooter, but we're going to innovate in this way or do this interesting art style, or here's a compelling story that we're going to tell through. I get that you're not making a whole new style of game, but at least you're trying to do something. You're pushing the boundary. You're making something interesting. Why? Because that game has to go to the market. It has to get the attention of press and players. It has to get well-reviewed in order to sell. And if you're just like, well, I'm making Candy Crush, but instead of candies, it's marshmallows, I'm like who cares? Whereas if there's a story to tell and we think there's actual potential and it's interesting, even if it's a first-person shooter or whatever standard genre, I mean, as long as there's other stuff that's innovative there, yeah. And that's your intent, yeah.
Hi. In the profit towards time slide,
yeah.
What's a reasonable amount of equity that I should sort of have at the very end? I mean, what's the equity towards the line? Yeah,
so the amount of equity is, so I could actually draw two lines where the amount of equity you give up here usually is quite high, and then over time the percent of equity goes down, in part because there's an opposing line which is risk, right? The risk here is very high, even though it's small amounts of money. Like for every mom that gives you 20 grand, the chances she's a penny of that back is very high. So the risk is very high, and even though over there the dollar amounts are very big, the risk is quite low because the business has been proven, you're making lots of money, and I may give you $50 million, but that's a way safer bet than giving you, 50K over here. So generally speaking, the dollar amounts are smaller, but the equity you give up is higher. And then over there, the dollar amounts are bigger, but the equity you give up is much smaller. I mean, there's rules of thumb. You can search on the web. I mean, we're coming in kind of in this sort of halfway sort of here, and we're taking 15%, give or take. But I mean, it's highly variable. But as a rule of thumb, you're giving up more here, less there for smaller amounts of money. Yeah. There was another question over here. Microphone. Hey, microphone. They went to run. Yeah, I mean it's there's no hard rule of thumb. Yeah, just back there with the white shirt on. But you should do some research. You can definitely use the general tech industry as parallels. Yeah.
Hi there. Well, as an indie company, how much? How precise of an estimate do you actually need to? Well, let me start over again. Sorry. Well, you need an estimate how much revenue there's actually going to be with this game. And how precise this actually has to be, because there's just this limited amount of knowledge you have for marketing.
Yeah, so I'm not a big fan of sales forecasts because it's mostly you're just pulling numbers from your butt. And so it's mostly just made up. You have to go through the exercise so you understand okay, if Steam is going to take this percent and here's what you have to build the model. but it's largely made up numbers. What I tend to prefer is comparables, where you say, well, my game is kind of like this one and this one and this one, and I can go and use Steam Spy and a few other tools or articles and see what kind of sales they've done. And visually I'm like this one, and gameplay-wise I'm like this one, and you can kind of get a sense based on the quality of my project, where I might land in there. So it really is super subjective. But even if you build the most complex spreadsheet with all, I'm going to look at that, and I don't really care that much about it. But we understand the game industry, so a more traditional investor may put a lot of emphasis on that sales model. Mileage may vary. All right, I think we've gone over time. So. All right, we have no more time for questions. Sorry. Thanks, folks, for everyone for coming.